Hello there folks, welcome to this video where we'll be taking a look at the new phaser module by Blue Lantern Modules. Phase for Daze. You could jump to any section of the video using the time code now. And let's get started. Phase for Daze is a 16 HP voltage controlled phaser based on the phaser section of the 1978 Farfisa Polychrome with some additional features. This has an internal LFO with 3 speed settings: normal, slow, and hyper, and a rate control knob. There's phase and feedback control, and there are CV inputs for both phase and feedback, along with the LFO rate. The LFO is internally routed to the phase and has 2 settings, triangle and sinus spike, which gives us an interesting exponential spike wave instead of a normal triangle wave. We also get an LFO out of the triangle wave. When the feedback is all the way up, the module will self-oscillate and the pitch can be controlled via CV. Then we have our audio in knob here, which shows us our normal range, and then anything past this is going to give us some gain, and we're going to lose some harmonics that would show up normally from the feedback. So be sure to fine-tune this to your liking on that specific patch. And then finally, we have the mix switch, which mixes the dry signal with the wet instead of it being just fully wet when off. Now, before we dive deeper into Phase for Daze, let's take a quick look at what a phaser actually is so we know more what's going on when we're using this phaser. A phaser is a series of all-pass filters, also known as stages. This module has 6. Each stage of the phaser inverts the phase of the incoming signal, causing phase cancellation at a certain frequency. This gives us a notch filter-like effect, basically. When you add more stages, you get more notches. Every 2 stages gives you another notch. This phaser has 6 stages and therefore has a 3-notch comb filter-like effect. But with no movement, the effect is nothing more than a strange EQ. Adjusting the phase of the wave changes the frequencies that get canceled out, therefore giving it a sweeping filter-like effect, which is why the LFO is applied to the phase. Think of it like a filter cutoff. And when the signal is fed back through the stages again, feedback, we get an interesting effect. The feedback actually gives us resonance to our filters. So you could think of the feedback as resonance, and we could think of the phase as cutoff. So to simplify a phaser even more, it's basically a comb filter with an LFO sweeping the cutoff frequency. And voila, you have a phaser. If you think about it as a filter, think of phase as the cutoff frequency and feedback as the resonance. So to recreate the sound of a 2-stage phaser, you could actually just use a notch filter and apply an LFO to the cutoff. Fun fact, phaser was created to imitate the sound of the Leslie speaker, or rotating speaker, commonly found in organs at the time. And now we know a bit more about phasers, enough so that we could take a better look at this phaser, Phase for Daze. So now let's dig into every nook and cranny of Phase for Daze by doing a rundown of every knob, switch, in and out. First to start, I have my audio input going into the input here, and the output going into my VCA low-pass filter here, but I have the filter all the way up, so it's just a VCA. Opening this up, so this is our waveform we have going right now. So this is our phaser. I'm going to get it back to the base stage right now. Okay, so here we have our phaser. And it is phasing our signal right now, but we can't really hear much because there's no movement to the phase. And when I move the phase, it changes the cutoff of that comb filter. And we can hear the effect. And now instead of just constantly turning that, we have an internal LFO that routes to the phase, which is this knob right here. And this controls the amount that it affects the phase. As just mentioned with the input, we have our audio in knob here, which is our attenuator for our audio signal, and it can actually gain or boost our signal, but we lose a lot of that whooshing when we turn it up higher, and you'll see more when we play with the next feature, feedback, which is this knob right here. Feedback feeds back the signal through the stages, giving us more resonance to our filter, so we get more whooshing sound. But we'll see if I turn this up, we really lose that. So we want to really fine-tune our audio in, as I mentioned before, especially when we're playing with the feedback. I feel like 12 to 1 o'clock is usually a good place. Now, before getting into the LFO section, I'm going to go into the CV inputs here for the phase and the feedback. So I'm turning our LFO mod off, and I'm routing an external LFO to the linear input here. We can see it's not super extreme as to the amount that it turns our knob, so to speak. It's kind of doing it really shallow. That's because the linear is just a lot more subtle of an effect. And if I go slower, it doesn't really have much effect at all. But you can get cool subtle effects. I'm just changing the rate of my LFO. Great. Now let's look at the exponential input, or the volt per octave input. Now you can see that it is really phasing our signal, and this is an attenuator for this input. Now it tracks at volt per octave with the knob all the way up. Now note it tracks for volt per octave only for about 2 octaves, and then it starts to go off. But we can tone it down with the attenuator here. Get something closer to the linear down here. But we could hear just how much differently it affects our exponential. Let's mix that in with this one. Now we also have this switch here for mix dry and off. Right now it is off, so it is just our wet signal coming through being phased. We could also mix it with our dry signal to get that full frequency range with the phased signal being fed in, and it gives us a little richer of a signal for a different effect. It's a bit richer and it's a bit fuller. And now let's look at the LFO section. So right now I have the LFO routed to the phase. And we can see we have our rate knob here at the top. And this is the speed at normal setting. Then we can go to slow setting, which basically picks up where we left off in the normal with a little bit of crossover, and goes slower from there. And it goes really slow. And then we have the hyperspeed, which goes to audio rates. And then we have our rate CV input here, which has its own attenuator. And I have just an LFO routing to the rate. It seems to only go so fast, but we can slow it down really far with this LFO, which is great. I'm going to go back to the normal speed. And then we have this switch here, which is the triangle wave of our LFO going to the mod input here of the phase. Or we could have it switch to this sinus spike, which we'll hear what that sounds right now. And here it is with just the normal LFO, so we could get a better sense of what that sinus spike sounds like. Triangle. Sinus. Which gives us an interesting effect when we patch out from this last output here. We have our out triangle output. And let's put this into the feedback CV because we have an attenuverter here. And I could tone the feedback down and then turn the attenuator up here. We have nice feedback pulsing coming from this triangle wave. And then I could invert it to kind of mix with the sinus wave a little bit differently. Another nice thing is our phase kind of acts like our base cutoff frequency, so we could kind of set it at a specific point to give us a nice offset to our sound. If we want a nice higher, brighter sound or a darker tone. Again, turning this gain up gives us a cool effect, but we could really hear that feedback better with this knob down a bit more again. Switch here. So you can hear it's not quite as bright as with the mix. And that is all the inputs, outputs, knobs, and switches of Phase for Daze. Now let's hear how different instruments sound through this phaser. Now let's look at some piano through Phase for Daze. Here I have just the LFO mod. Let's switch the mix in. And adjust our rate via another LFO. And the same LFO that's adjusting our rate can adjust our feedback here. Get a nice drive to it, but again, we lose that feedback. Switch that. Actually, switch this back. And I'm going to add a bursting LFO to our linear input here. So we can hear just that. Add it in with the LFO mod. Get this cool little flapping sound. I kind of like that grit on the piano on this. And that is the phaser on piano. Now let's check out the phaser with some drums through it. Now these are the same LFOs and patches that I had from the piano. Now let's patch in that fluttering. Check out the hyper mode. Let's take out that fluttering now. Go back to normal. And the sinus spike. And that is drums on Phase for Daze. Now let's take a listen to some vocals through Phase for Daze. But first, let's just listen to a part of the raw vocals. And now let's take a listen to it through Phase for Daze. Now, pardon the little crackles in the sound every once in a while. I can't get my interface to play nice with outputting the sound from Ableton, and it just keeps giving me these weird crackles. So just ignore those in this demonstration, or think of them as little vinyl defects. So, vocals in Phase for Daze, I have the rate going really slow to give it a more somber feel, like the vocals. And then I have the LFO mod nearly all the way up to give us a lot of phase change since it's going so slow. I have the feedback all the way down. Otherwise, we're just going to be getting this sound into the mix. So what I'm going to be playing with is the audio in to give us some drive every once in a while, and then bring it back down to the normal. And let's take a listen. See, there's a crackle. Just think of it as a vinyl dust scratch vinyl noise. It's a cool effect. And that is some nice soft vocals through the phaser to give it a nice softer sound. Now let's look at some guitar through phase for Daze. For this I have a looping envelope controlling the feedback amount, which when I turn it up you could hear that. And then I have just the LFO mod in the sinus spike mode with a normal LFO, and then I have a really slow LFO changing my rate mod, so I'm getting a more varied rate throughout the scene. And let's listen to the guitar. And that is some guitar through Phase for Daze. And that's all for this video on the new phaser module, Phase for Daze by Blue Lantern. Until next time.